I mean, that's my thing. If I was there, I'd remember it, wouldn't I?
Oh, if I knew, I'd tell you. I wasn't there. I know I wasn't there. I wasn't even down the stairs. I wasn't nowhere around. I don't know what the hell you guys want. If you know about this, I would say, but I do not know. I wasn't there. The way I think you sounded to me is like I was there. Maybe I was there. I just don't know. My recollection, yeah.
How many times did you cut her?
Just once. Cigarette in the living room. She was killed in the bedroom.
Didn't she like being on the corner, or was it?
You were there, you're the one that held her down, the band asked you to find help. Is that correct?
Yes.
Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Lindsay, and today's video is going to be a true crime case, a finally solved true crime case that has been on my mind for months and months. This is a case I've been wanting to talk about. It's been on my list for ages, and today I am finally going to tell you the story of Angie Dodge. This is a case that happened back in 1996 in Idaho Falls in the States, but I'm very excited to tell you about this, and I do want to give you a couple of disclaimers just before I start this video. This video will mention rape and also a gross miscarriage of justice. So if any of these topics aren't for you, then I highly recommend you click out of this video. I'm sure you can find other videos on my channel that are more appropriate for you. But with that being said, let's just travel back to 1977. Angie Dodge was born on December 21st, 1977 in Vancouver, Washington. She was the only daughter of Jack and Carol Dodge, but she also had 3 older brothers, making her the baby of the family. The whole family lived in Idaho Falls, and in 1996, she had just finished high school, she had a summer job, and she was hoping to get into Idaho State University. She was a very bright person. She was known to be very outgoing, very outspoken. She was definitely a social butterfly. She had a lot of friends, and she was also 5'11". She had always been very tall, and she had been bullied quite a lot about her height. I know, especially as a girl, like being tall, you definitely stand out a lot more, probably the same way some men are bullied for being short, and she never appreciated it, obviously. So whenever she would see someone else be bullied, she would always step in, defend that person, and really get into the bully's face and be like, you stop that right now, it's not cool. And she would always call them out because she knew exactly how it felt. So overall, she was an incredibly kind and caring person, but also was known to never take no for an answer. She was very determined. Towards the end of May 1996, she and her mother got into a little argument. She had broken one of the house rules. Obviously, she lived at home and there were rules, even though she was 18. And for whatever rule it was, it never mentioned which rule it was, but Angie had broken that house rule. She hadn't respected it, and as a result, her mother told her to just move out. I don't think it was a heated argument. I don't think it was, you know, like, you've disrespected me and my ancestors, get out of the house. I don't think she was really kicked out, but the rules were there for a reason, and her mom said, you know what, if you're not going to really respect these rules, you're 18, you can just live on your own and do whatever you want. That was the impression I got from that argument. So Angie moved out. She found an upstairs apartment in Idaho Falls. She was actually quite excited to move out and live on her own. That is the experience for quite a lot of people. It's always exciting to just have your own place for the first time. But after 3 weeks of living on her own, she finally went back to her mom's house just to kind of catch up and speak to her. They hadn't seen each other in those 3 weeks since she had been told to move out, and her mom was so relieved to catch up with her, and she was so relieved that Angie was no longer mad at her, to which Angie responded, not even in a blue moon. Angie was obviously not angry at her mom at all. Everything was fine, and they managed to hug and tell each other how much they loved each other. And I feel like my mom's name is Carol, and as an adult now, I know when I was younger, maybe we would like disagree and get into arguments, but I definitely understand. I don't think I could ever be mad at my mom. I know she's watching. Hi, Mom. But overall, she was just relieved that her daughter just wasn't mad at her and that they could still get along. And they ended up catching up and chatting until about 20 past 10, after which Angie walked back to her apartment. However, the next day, on June 13th, 1996, She failed to show up for work, and that was incredibly unusual. I think for a lot of people it would be unusual to just not turn up, but this is before cell phones were a thing, so the coworkers from her job decided to drop by her house just to make sure she was okay. It's only once they get inside of her apartment and start looking into every room that they find her dead in her bedroom. Police was called immediately, and when they found Angie in her flat, they immediately realized that this was a very serious crime scene that was going to need a forensics team. She was found lying on her back on the floor next to her bed, and her sweatpants had been pulled down and her shirt had been pulled up, revealing severe stab wounds all over her body, including a fatal stab wound to her throat. You could see all of the blood splatter on the walls, and for the officers who attended the crime scene, it was one of the worst crimes they had ever seen. This was Idaho Falls. This was a very small population, 65,000 people. It was a very quiet town. Nothing bad ever happened there, nothing of that nature. And it was very obvious that she had been raped prior to being murdered. Police collected DNA from the crime scene, mostly from the semen found on Angie, as well as skin cells under her nails from self-defense. There was actually quite a lot of evidence left behind, quite a lot of DNA, and Carol, Angie's mom, was convinced that this would be very quickly solved. Police started out by questioning friends, family, acquaintances, colleagues, anyone they could think of, and collected over 100 DNA samples, but none of them came back as a match. 6 months went by and police still had zero leads. They had no answers. They had no idea who could have done this to Angie. And the entire community, like the entire city of Idaho Falls, was terrified. And also they wanted results, like they wanted answers. They wanted police to do their job and find out who had done this, because who could possibly get away with a crime of this nature in a town where nothing like this ever happens. In January 1997, police finally get a tip. A man called Benjamin Hobbs had been arrested in Nevada for raping a woman at knife point. And the reason why the police were so interested in this man is because he actually knew Angie Dodge. He had attended the funeral, which made police believe that maybe he could have something to do with this. The nature of the crime was very similar, the circumstances were similar, so they decide to go down to Nevada and question Benjamin. He immediately tells them that he has absolutely nothing to do with Angie's rape or murder, and of course police don't believe him, but he does ask police if she was raped, and if she was raped, then there would be evidence that would disqualify him, that would rule him out as a suspect, because he knows he didn't do this. He wasn't there that night. He was very confident that there would be absolutely no evidence to link back to him. So he provided a DNA sample to police. They made their way back to Idaho Falls, and the results came back negative. So it wasn't a match to the DNA found at the crime scene, unfortunately. However, police don't stop there. They thought this was quite a good lead, so they start looking into Benjamin's friends. Maybe he had a circle of friends that could have something to do with it. Maybe if he's capable of doing something like that in Nevada, maybe the people he hung out with back home would be of similar nature. Police start focusing on Chris Tapp, who was a close friend of Ben Hobbs. He was a high school dropout. He was smoking quite a lot of weed. He was actually couch surfing at the time. He wasn't really working full time. He was in and out of jobs. And he had also been seen with Angie Dodge the night before her murder. So police think this is a great person to interrogate. One of the detectives who was interrogating Chris Tapp was actually a school resource officer at the high school that Chris used to go to. So Chris actually knew him. It was a familiar face and he felt like he could trust him, and the detective actually said, "You know me, I'm not going to mess with you, I'm not going to screw with you, you can trust me." And there's this feeling of confidence and trust between the two of them. So Chris Tapp is willing to answer any questions they might have about Angie Dodge. And it doesn't matter how many times he tells them that he had nothing to do with Angie that night or what happened to her, they keep pushing it. They made him take quite a few polygraph tests, and after a while, his parents hire an attorney. They had a scheduled interview, which he didn't show up for, and when police go to his home, which was technically his parents' house, he was living at home, they speak to his mother, who said that Chris would show up on January 13th with his attorney and he would answer any questions they had in the presence of his attorney. And police weren't happy with that at all. They wanted answers now. They had questions and they wanted answers now. So instead of waiting, police decided to come back with an arrest warrant, and they charged Tapp with being an accessory to a felony. This didn't really change any of his answers. He still denied any involvement, and he ended up facing a series of interrogations and polygraph tests that would last up to 60 hours total. That is insane in itself. Like, they really just kept going with this. And as we've seen time and time before, through the intensive interrogations, his story begins to change. He gets grilled by detectives so much that after a while he starts saying, you know what, maybe I was there, I just don't know. And police are like, okay, cool. Okay, so this guy is finally cracking. He's finally admitting to something. So what else is he hiding? Let's keep asking, see what happens. And Chris Tapp was answering all these questions because he genuinely wanted to help with the investigation. He wanted to find who killed Angie. He wanted to help, and he also felt like if he started answering questions or giving something back to police, that they would see it as cooperating and that they would give him a break, basically being like, okay, you're working with us and therefore innocent. They asked him to go over the events of that night and to talk them through what happened. And he actually tells them that Ben was there. So Ben Hobbs, who had already been ruled out because his DNA did not match the DNA at the crime scene. But the problem is neither does Chris Tapp's DNA. Like, his DNA does not match the DNA at the crime scene either. So far they have 0 matches, but they are still questioning Chris. And instead of taking a step back and thinking, you know what, neither of these guys are a match to the DNA, are we looking in the wrong place? They just assume that there's a third person who would match the DNA, though. So it's not just 2 people there, there's a third person involved. So they start asking Chris, who's the third person? You need to tell us, because we have DNA evidence that proves that there is a third person. Now, what they actually meant, or what actually was the case, was that there was DNA that matched neither of them, so it had to be someone else. But instead of saying, it wasn't you guys, or at least your DNA isn't there, so we need to look for someone else, they just believe that there is a third person and that Chris is going to lead them to that person. So Chris Tapp starts telling police that maybe his friend Jeremy Sarges was there. Police ask him, was he really there? He says, to my recollection, yes, he was there. Of course, Jeremy finds out that Chris had brought him into this whole mess and police had to interrogate him as well. He was absolutely furious. He was irate that Chris would drag him into this when he had absolutely nothing to do with this. And I love his interrogation because he just tells police that they're wasting their time, they've got the wrong person, and they're looking like idiots. Like, they're making themselves look like a fool. Obviously the detective, late 90s detective who hears that is not happy at all. He's like, oh, I look like a fool, you look like a fool. And kind of go back and forth until they test his DNA, find out that it's still not a match, and that he had an alibi anyway, and the alibi checked out. Instead of police thinking, you know what, this Chris Tapp guy is really giving us dead ends, maybe we should look into someone else, they think, wow, this guy's just lying to us. Like, the detective went back to Chris Tapp to interrogate him again and said, you're screwing with me, like, you're screwing with us, you're lying to us, you told us Jeremy was there and he wasn't. And if you actually look back at the tapes, you can just see the evolution of Chris's answers. Chris started out by saying he wasn't there, and then he says, you know what, maybe I was there, to no, I was there. And even when police asked him how many times he stabbed Angie, he said just once, even though police knows that it's not just once, it's more than once. And they tell him, well, you know, one of the stab wounds is above the breast. There was a stab wound just above the breast. And Chris is like, right, that's the one I did then. I mean, they even ask him where the crime happened. They said, you know, where did it happen? Was it the bedroom, the living room, the kitchen, like the hallway, the stairs? And Chris says the living room, which didn't happen in the living room, it happened in the bedroom. Police is like, no, it was the bedroom, wrong answer. And then Chris told them that she lived on the corner of a street, but she lived in the middle of a block. Like, nothing was adding up. And never mind the fact that the DNA doesn't match or that the stories don't line up, his answers aren't consistent. Police have a confession and they just run with it. On February 3rd, 1997, Chris Tapp is charged with first-degree murder with an enhancement for using a deadly weapon as well as rape. But the case isn't solved. They still need to find this third man, or maybe second man. At this point, I don't think police knows what they know. I don't think they know how many people were there. They just know that they need someone else to fit that DNA profile. Because Chris Tapp had confessed to being present at the crime scene, and he had also brought Ben Hobbs into this, Chris was actually charged, but Ben Hobbs wasn't, because he never confessed to being there and his DNA didn't match. So the only reason Chris was being charged was because he confessed to having attended the crime scene, that he was there the night of the crime. And unfortunately, in May 1998, the jury found Chris Tapp guilty. Carol Dodge actually went to trial. She showed up every single day. She wanted justice for her daughter, and she wanted to get answers, basically. And it was actually really hard for her, obviously, to attend trial because she had to relive the loss of her daughter every single day, and she also had to be repeatedly faced with what had been done to her daughter. Carol absolutely wanted the death penalty for Chris Tapp, and the defense team could easily see the glaring issues with his confession and the inconsistencies in his answers. However, the prosecution followed the very strong motto of innocent people don't confess. So the jury ended up finding Chris guilty as an accomplice. As you can see from the footage, he genuinely cannot believe he's actually being sent to prison. Like, this is actual footage that could be used for any situation of, this cannot be real, this cannot be happening to me. He could not believe it was happening, and when he was asked to stand up and make his last statement, all he told the judge was, "I am not the monster that everyone thinks I am. Judge, I ask you to spare my life." And Carol had to walk out at this point, which I can understand. And the judge opted against the death penalty, and he gave him 30 years to life instead. He also said that if there wasn't a confession from Chris Tapp, that there would be no conviction. Carol was very, very upset that Chris Tapp never got the death penalty, but she was equally furious that police wasn't making any progress in finding whose DNA it was at the crime scene. She wanted to find out who had really done this. It wasn't enough to convict Chris. She needed more. She wanted the full story. She wanted all the answers, and she wanted justice. And she felt like police wasn't doing enough. And as much as she hated Chris, she would still go to jail and visit him and beg him to tell her what happened and who was there that night. Eventually, she decided that nothing was happening fast enough, and actually nothing was happening at all. She decided to just investigate herself. Just like her daughter, she is very fierce, she is very determined, and she ended up marching up to the police station every single day demanding updates. Like, knock knock, guess who? What are you up to today? What are you doing to help find, my daughter's murderer? What's going on? What's on the schedule? Let's work together. And they got very quickly annoyed because, they didn't have any answers. They had no leads. So she's like, fine, it's cool. I'll just do this myself. She started going over every single document from the court case. She started looking at every piece of evidence. She would drive around at night. She would follow people in the street. She ended up following Jeremy Sarges, and she came up to him and said, "I know you're involved and I'm gonna get you," which he didn't appreciate, obviously, but he also felt just genuinely bad that she would be in so much pain and so distressed that she would resort to following him around and threatening him, basically. She would drive around at night. She would interrogate drug dealers. I mean, she put herself in a lot of stupid situations, and I'm not judging her or calling her stupid, but she definitely put herself in a lot of danger. Like, you don't go around interrogating drug dealers, but she was determined. She would get back at like 4 a.m. and start all over again the next day. And if you think she only did that for a few weeks, she didn't. She did it for months and years. After a while, she decided to try a different approach. She decided to go over Chris Tapp's interrogation tapes. She was convinced that police had missed something and that she was paying attention so she would be able to notice something, see something, or maybe hear something that police completely missed. That had to be the case, because it didn't seem like they were doing much. Maybe they just didn't care. That's what it looked like to her. So as she's watching all of these interrogation tapes, she's slowly coming to the conclusion that this man had never been inside Angie's apartment. This man had nothing to do with her murder. He clearly didn't know how to answer. He clearly didn't know what was going on, and he was just giving information that police had given him. And that's very scary for Carol Dodge, because obviously that means that there is not only potentially an innocent man in prison, but a very dangerous man out on the streets. In 2008, 10 whole years after Chris Tapp's initial sentencing, Carol Dodge tracks down his new defense lawyer. John Thomas was leaving the court one day when he got, let's say, ambushed is a strong word, but he got approached by Angie Dodge's mother, and he obviously recognized her, and he was thinking, shit, like, she's gonna be mad at me. I'm defending, you know, the man who's in prison for murdering her daughter. She's gonna be upset. She's gonna start shouting or something. And actually, she just pulled him aside and said, I think you need to look at the tapes, the interrogation tapes for Chris Tapp, because I don't think he's guilty. And this was the first time someone had come up to a defense lawyer, like the parent of a victim coming up to a defense lawyer to say, actually, I think your client is innocent. But she wasn't above that. Carol was not above that. She just wanted justice. And of course, John Thomas looked at the tapes and came to the same conclusion. The entire interrogation was incredibly suggestive. So as I've said, police would ask a question and Chris Tapp would answer, trying to guess what police would want to hear. For example, where did it happen? Was it in the bedroom, living room, kitchen, garden? And he would say living room, and police is like, wrong, it was the bedroom. He's like, yeah, okay, bedroom. So basically, police would interrogate him, he would give the wrong answer, they would correct him with the right answer, and share facts about the crime scene that Chris never would have known if police hadn't told him, because he wasn't there. And actually, looking at the tapes, they could tell that the polygrapher wasn't even interested in finding out if Chris's answers were accurate or matched anything with the true facts. He just wanted Chris to basically confess and basically would make his own stories fit the narrative so that they could finally arrest someone, because not that it's any excuse, obviously the community had a lot of pressure on police to solve this. The detectives who originally worked on this case had all retired by the time Carol and the defense lawyer started looking into the tapes again, and none of them wished to comment on that, which is incredibly frustrating, which is an understatement. It actually drives me insane. I want them all in court. In 2014, Michael Usry Jr. was accused of the murder and rape of Angie Dodge through familial DNA searching. What happened was his father had actually sent a DNA sample to a genealogy foundation that ended up getting acquired by Ancestry.com, which a lot of people are familiar with. And Idaho Falls got a court order to search the Ancestry.com database, and they ended up finding a close match to the DNA found at the crime scene. The reason they ended up suspecting the son of the person whose DNA was sent to Ancestry.com was because he was a filmmaker based in Louisiana who would often travel to Idaho, including Idaho Falls, for his work, and it seemed to somewhat match. You know, there's a close match DNA-wise. This man is traveling to Idaho Falls, and on top of that, he did make a movie called Murderabilia that involves the murder of a young woman, so police are thinking this is too many red flags to ignore. Michael volunteered a saliva sample to clear his name, and when the results came back, it was negative. It wasn't a match to the DNA at the crime scene. However, he never really got an apology for what police put him through. And on top of that, the public was very upset with police using the Ancestry.com database to solve their crimes. It was a clear breach of privacy and also was considered incredibly unethical And nowadays, Ancestry.com claims that they do not allow law enforcement to use their services to investigate crimes or identify human remains, which I understand from an ethics point of view is the right thing to do. However, I wonder just how many crimes we could solve through the DNA samples people send to those companies. But that's not the point. The point is it is a breach of privacy and also incredibly unethical. So that is no longer allowed. However, that is what put Michael on the suspect list, and he was very quickly cleared. In the meantime, Chris Stapp had appealed multiple times. He had tried to appeal as often as possible, and it wasn't until he was 44 years old that he was considered a potential victim instead of a murderer. Although there was no evidence to point in another direction, there was enough doubt about Chris's involvement that led to the defense team and the prosecution team to come to an agreement. I don't know how often that happens, but the defense team and the prosecution decided to clear Chris's name of the rape charges. So they dropped the rape charges. He was no longer a registered sex offender, and that dropped his sentence down 10 years. So he had a 30-year to life sentence, and without the rape charges, he was serving 20 years, which unfortunately, by the time this happened, he had already served. This man had already spent over 20 years in jail. He did get released, and he celebrated with Carol Dodge, but he was still a convicted murderer. So that made his entire life incredibly difficult after getting out of jail. First of all, because he'd spent over 20 years in jail, and it's incredibly hard to adapt to life and what's going on in the world after spending that much time in prison. And on top of that, he was not cleared of the murder charges. So good luck finding a job. It is thanks to Carol Dodge that he could walk free. She wasn't the one to put him in jail in the first place, though it is important to know that she went from wanting the death penalty to clearing his name, at the very least for the rape charge. However, she wasn't stopping there. Nothing was stopping Carol Dodge. She was an absolute tornado through this entire investigation, and the only thing that would stop her was solving her daughter's case, and that was it. By that point in the case, it is about 2017, and police decide to look into the case again. They start with a fresh batch of detectives and police officers who don't have the prejudice that the previous police officers had, and they have like brand new eyes on the case, and they decide to just start fresh, start over, and see what they can find, and they have nothing. And again, Carol is not satisfied with that. Honestly, I feel like she should be president. She's like, what do you mean you have nothing? Do I have to do this myself again? And she did. She absolutely did. She had been following the case, and she had been keeping up with technology and forensics, and she knew that there had been huge improvements in genetic genealogy. And she decided to reach out to C.C. Moore, who was a genetic genealogist who was internationally recognized for reuniting children with their biological parents. Obviously consensual on both parts. And of course, police was also included in this new approach. The DNA C.C. had to work with was quite degraded. Obviously, it had been 20 years since the samples were taken, but she still had hope that they would be able to work with what they had and find a new lead. The first thing to do was to get a list of matches, so people who shared DNA with the sample, even if it was a distant relative. I genuinely do not understand how genetic genealogy works, but it does, and you could spend 5 days explaining it to me. I feel like I would not do a good job explaining it to you, but she basically managed to create a few genetic networks, and she would find common ancestors that would overlap, and she ended up narrowing it down to one couple. It was Clarence Ussery and Cleo Landrum. This means that any descendants from that couple could be the suspect. Obviously, they're searching for a male suspect, so it could be any son, grandson from that couple that would match the DNA sample, but obviously they have to look at timelines and how old people were around that time to make sure that, you know, it can't be the great-great-great-grandson because he would be too young, but it might not be able to be the son because they would be too old. So they're also looking at time and generations. She narrowed it down to 6 men who would fit the genetic network, which is absolutely mind-blowing. And again, as I've said before, and I'll say it again, forensics is my favorite part of any case. So the fact that she managed to narrow it down to 6 men, 5 of them living over 1,000 miles from Idaho, and 1 of them living in Idaho, is absolutely insane. And she ended up using obituaries, marriage announcements, engagement announcements, any city archives about that family name to figure out who this could be. And they seem to have one suspect in particular that could fit the profile. Police immediately start looking into this man. They are basically following him around discreetly, trying to get a DNA sample from him without him realizing, because they're afraid that if they confront this person, he would either take off or refuse to volunteer a DNA sample. And it could be difficult to get a warrant for that. So they started following him around, and over time they realized that the car he's driving, the registration for the car he was driving had expired. So they have a reason to pull him over, and they're thinking, actually, if we make him take a breath test, then maybe we can get a DNA sample from that, and he wouldn't really know that that's why we're taking the breath test. And they did. They managed to pull him over, and he volunteered to take the breath test, and they had a sample, and they sent it back to the lab. But when the results came back, it was the completely wrong profile. And Cece was absolutely crushed. It means she pretty much had to start all over again. She still knew that this would have to be from the couple, Clarence and Cleo. However, she got the suspect wrong. She needed to go back to the drawing board and figure out how she could have gotten this wrong, basically, because science doesn't lie. So what happened? She ended up digging very deep, and she actually noticed that one of the descendants from that couple had gotten married at a very young age, and this man's bride at the time of the marriage, of the wedding, was 16 years old, which even if it's the early 1900s, I feel like that's still very, very young. And generally speaking, you don't really marry a 16-year-old just because you're in love. Usually it's because you're pregnant. However, the couple didn't last very long, but they didn't have any listed kids. So she wasn't sure how to figure out whether or not they did have a child, and it just didn't show up in the papers. She wasn't sure how to figure it out, but she knew that it had to be from that union. Her team finally found the obituary for the wife, so the one who had gotten married at 16. And in the obituary, they realized that she had adopted her stepdad's name, her little stepdad's last name. So that's why the descendant's name never showed up in the research, is because she didn't take the husband's name after the marriage ended. She took her stepdad's name. And in the obituary, it mentioned a son. And that son happened to live in Idaho Falls. At that point, she was 100% sure that this was the suspect, but police obviously still had to repeat the whole following this person around and getting DNA from them to check against the DNA profile. They needed to be absolutely sure scientifically that this was the right person. They needed more than her family tree research, not to downplay her research, but obviously they needed solid evidence. So they start following him again. The man's name was Brian Dips, and at the time of Angie's murder, he was 30 years old, going through a divorce, and more importantly, lived right across from her apartment. Police follow him very discreetly. They really do not want to blow this, and they don't want to spook someone who could very well be a little bit on edge. If this is the real suspect, then, you know, he's gone 23 years without getting caught, but he could very well be very suspicious of police or someone following him. Who knows? He could still be on his guards. So police are very, very careful, and as they're following him with multiple cars, they realize that he's a smoker. And as he's driving, he had the really bad habit of throwing his cigarette out the window, which makes it public property. I believe trash is public property. Especially if you're going to throw your cigarette out the window, you deserve to have it collected by police. I hate people who throw cigarette butts out the window. That's just neither here nor there. But he threw the cigarette out the window and police are like, whoa, 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 stop the car, let him go. And they run to try and find the cigarette butt. But unfortunately, there's too many people throwing stupid cigarette butts out their window for them to find the real one, the one that belonged to Brian Dipps. So they're looking around, they find dozens and dozens of cigarette butts. They don't know which one it is. And instead of collecting like 100 of them and testing them all, they decide to just start over and follow him again. And maybe the next time around, they can isolate the cigarette butt that belongs to Brian Dipps. And they do. He does it all over again. He's a creature of habit. He does the same routine every day. He goes to the same places, and a few days later he's smoking, throws it out the window, and this time police isolate the cigarette butt, send it to testing, and it comes back a match. What's so interesting is that they ended up stopping him on his way out of the bank. He had gone to the bank, and as he was coming back to his truck, police went up to him and said, look, you're wanted for the murder of Angie Dodge. Will you come back with us for an interrogation? I think they were being polite. Obviously, they were going to arrest him, but they were hoping that if they could just get him in for questioning, that he would be more willing to answer instead of lawyering up immediately. And he ended up agreeing, but what he did was he actually ended up going back into his car with a detective next to him and decided to go back to his house. And obviously there was another car of detectives following them. When he got back to his house, he let his dog out, he hugged his mom, got back into the car, and they went to the police department. And they interrogated him, of course, immediately. He said he had nothing to do with it, that he had nothing to do with Angie's murder. But after 5.5 hours of interrogation, police finally tell him that they have DNA evidence on him. So he decides to take a cigarette break, and police obviously let him. So he goes smoke a cigarette, and when he comes back, he pauses before finally confessing. He claimed that when he went over to Angie's house, it was only to rape her. He didn't plan on killing her, and he actually was surprised that she had died as a result of the stab wounds he inflicted, which is incredibly hard to believe given that she was all over the news for years and years, especially in that neighborhood. The person across from you, like in the street, got murdered, and you're like, I thought she was still alive, actually. So basically what he told police, he said he went over there to rape her, and he was incredibly high on cocaine, and he was incredibly drunk as well. He had a pocket knife with him, and he didn't mean to murder her, but he also doesn't remember murdering her. He only remembers the rape part, but he also isn't denying that he killed her. He just claims that he doesn't remember murdering her. In February 2021, which is this year, which is absolutely insane, this started in 1997, Brian Dipps, is it Drips or Dips? Oh my God. In February 2021, Brian Dipps pled guilty to the crime. I have this sinking feeling that I have been saying Brian Dipps instead of Brian Drips. I am very sorry if I got that wrong. I will have corrected that on the screen, but his name is Brian Lee Dipps Sr. He was 55 at the time of the sentencing, and he had to serve at least 20 years in prison before being eligible for parole, which is like, I wish they had kept the same energy they had for Chris. He got 30 years to life, and this man only has to serve at least 20 years. I mean, I don't think he'll be coming out. That's not the point, though. I don't understand how he got over 20 years running around free. Chris didn't. So that's a bit frustrating, but I know court cases the sentencing can, I don't know, vary for whatever reason. Dipps admitted that no one else had been involved in the crime, which confirmed the fact that the DNA profile found on Angie Dodge and on her clothing only belonged to one person. There was never any evidence that there was more than one person present, because even if someone had only murdered her or only raped her, you would have more than one DNA profile, and police never had any evidence of that. So it did confirmed the fact that he acted alone and no one else had been involved. A few final words to wrap this video up. Chris Tapp finally got exonerated in 2019 and had a civil lawsuit against the city of Idaho Falls and 7 former members of the police department, so 7 previous officers. On March 5th, 2021, he passed a new bill into law, the Wrongful Conviction Act, which required that innocent people who served time for crimes they had not committed receive compensation. It was a fixed sum of $62,000 for each year of wrongful imprisonment and $70,000 for each year served on death row. And this case is obviously another very valid example as to why the death penalty is problematic, because if the judge had given Chris the death penalty, he might have been killed before being proven innocent. He might have never been let out. He might have never survived. He received a 7-figure compensation. However, because of his wrongful conviction, he never got to experience the average life that a lot of people get to experience, such as raising a family, pursuing a career, any basic freedoms that people have and take for granted because it is a basic freedom, it's expected. He never got that. He spent his most formative years in prison. Carol Dodge never stopped fighting for her daughter. There are about, 5 to 7 stages of grief, and she got stuck on the anger one, and she didn't stop. She didn't move on until she got justice. And this was one of the cases when I was researching it, it was so hard to keep it together because you see just how fueled by emotion she is when trying to solve this case. I don't think her energy or her determination wavered in the 23 years it took to find out who had actually raped and murdered her daughter. She said that if she hadn't had the opportunity to hold Angie in her arms that night and tell her how much she loved her, that she probably couldn't have pushed this hard. But she also hoped that she would live long enough to see this day, because obviously at the time Angie was 18 and she was her youngest child. So Carol was already older, and then, 23 years later, obviously she's getting to an age where some people never live long enough to get justice for the crimes of their loved ones. So she was very relieved to know that she could experience that. And if she hadn't pushed police and started her own investigation, it's very likely that Angie Dodge's case would still be unsolved. That's it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm so happy I finally got to talk about this case because I think about it a lot. And it's been on my mind for a really long time. I don't know if you'd ever heard of this. I think it is quite popular in the States. I'm taking a little break from French cases. I wanted to speak about Angie Dodge today. Let me know down below what you think, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.